Hello, folks. My name is John Wood Jr. You are watching The John Wood Jr. Show. Well, first, let me say it's wonderful to speak to you. Now, this show is going to be a little bit different than a lot of things that you see dealing with politics on YouTube or television, for that matter, or in the podcast space. First of all, let me just say, I am entirely unprepared for this opening episode of the John Wood Jr. Show. I made a decision to launch this show to give myself an opportunity to communicate with you about the way in which we as a people can work together across our differences to build a society that approximates, that grows closer to the realization of that dream of a more perfect union, that dream of a beloved community, in Martin Luther King Jr.'s language. But I didn't really have time to write a script for this or to even generate an outline or anything like that. And why is that? Well, I was busy. I was running back and forth. I just got back from Orlando. I had the opportunity to visit a thing called the State Policy Network's annual meeting. It's a gathering of conservative-leaning think tanks from across the country and other folks in the conservative public policy and philanthropic space. While I was there, I also had the opportunity to address a gathering of mediators associated with John Jay College in New York, a progressive-leaning assortment of individuals from across the world, an international audience of individuals who facilitate interaction and dialogue and peacemaking between people of difference and in places of conflict. And so that's sort of how I live my life, running back and forth, talking to folks on the left, talking to folks on the right, and seeking to, I suppose, persuade people to take an interest in this movement that is rising subtly, slowly maybe, but in a real and increasingly visible and solid way, to get people to take an interest in this movement to build a house united in American society, this movement to rebuild the bonds of social trust across our partisan divide, across our racial divisions, and across the other boundary lines that set us apart and in opposition to each other, as people who regard each other as enemies sometimes on the basis of our labels and in our differences, but who ought to be looking at one another as neighbors and potentially friends with whom we share a nation, and therefore an interest in the freedom and prosperity of American democracy. That is what I care about. If you're watching this show, if you are interested in myself and the message that I communicate and in the work of braver angels, then it is likely the case that this is what you are interested in too. You may be a liberal, you may be a conservative or a Democrat or Republican. You may look at yourself as a progressive or libertarian. You may have any number of labels. You may be African American. You may be white. You may be a millennial. You may be a baby boomer. You may be somebody who is deeply religious, or you may be somebody who is firm in his convictions that God is not real, but that nevertheless it is incumbent upon us to be good people, to be honest and honorable, and to treat each other well. There's a deeper level of moral commonality that we have to unearth within the residents of this country, within those who occupy the American project, to allow us to be able to build a nation and to rebuild a democracy together that at this moment, I would argue, is faltering. Now, we have seen across the course of the last several years a breakdown in trust and confidence amongst the American people towards their institutions. The American people, we do not trust the media much anymore. We do not trust the universities. We damn sure don't trust the political parties and the politicians. But worst of all, our trust in each other is at a low. We are in a moment in time where so many of us think that the way forward in American life is to make sure that our politicians, our political party, our candidates get elected and seize power. But even if the right people get elected, if the American people can't work together, then the rules that govern our institutions will only ever be used as clubs and cudgels to undermine the opposition at the expense of the larger republic. So this is the sort of thing I advocate that we think about. This is the sort of thing that I argue we must organize in opposition to. We must rediscover goodwill to retie the ties that bind Americans, right? So to some folks, that'll seem pie in the sky. But if that message resonates with you, it is perhaps because you recognize the fact that a free society cannot exist without the foundation of goodwill. Just like a family can't exist without love. And just like a marriage cannot long survive without trust. So let that sink in for a moment. And if you're interested in that point of view, but skeptical about it, I hope you reflect upon it. But for folks who are interested in seeing something change in America, well, the next logical question becomes, what do we do about it? What do we do about the divisions that make our society feel as if it is teetering on the brink of one disaster or another? And it does seem like we just reel from one disaster to another these days, doesn't it? And it's important to have perspective because, of course, history always brings with it incredible challenges. Every generation faces them. Well, this is our generation's moment. COVID-19, the breakdown of trust in our institutions, of course, the current catastrophe in Afghanistan, a reckoning with respect to our racial history in this country, but also a moment in which technology seems to be disrupting our ability to make sense and to reason together in a way that itself threatens the long-term prospects of democratic society, even as we may be thankful for the blessings and the incredible, the incredible wealth and utility that technology and information technology and digital entrepreneurialism brings. Now, you may have an assessment of the sort of, the layout of the problems of American society that differs a little bit from mine. But again, every generation faces their challenges. We shouldn't feel indignant about the fact that we've got our own. But, at the bottom of all that is this question. If it is the case that the most fundamental challenge that American society faces is our inability to work together as Americans and trust each other as Americans, how do we operate and organize in response to that, right? And so that is going to be a big part of what we talk about here on the John Wood Jr. Show, because it is the heart of our work at Braver Angels. Now, many folks who follow me, of course, will already be familiar with Braver Angels. Some of you are likely to be members. And for that, I'm very much grateful. But for those who aren't familiar or who are not very familiar, let me say a little bit about what it is that we do. So I'm a national ambassador for an organization called Braver Angels. Braver Angels, is America's largest grassroots bipartisan organization dedicated to the work of political depolarization. Although I tend to prefer to deepen that explanation by saying that what we are really committed to is the revival of the communal spirit of American democracy, if you will, restoring civic trust across our nation. And so we do this in a number of different ways. We work directly with politicians and with government and with state and local office holders. And on the federal level, we've got workshops and activities that are being participated in by members of Congress. We have programs on college campuses. We have a fledgling media network. You are observing that in action right now. Work in progress, but I think that that's okay. We even have a singer-songwriter community. We invite artists and musicians to participate in our programs and to be a major part of putting on the sorts of events and gatherings that allow the American people to come together and get to know each other in ways that sometimes debate and dialogue does not perfectly facilitate, because we are more than just our intellectual senses and our ability to speak. But more than anything, we are rooted in the grassroots. We are in local communities. We are at present 10,000 members strong, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, and others, all across the country, with 80 local bipartisan chapters across America. Well, we refer to them as Braver Angels Alliances. And what do we actually do on the ground? What are we doing in Congress? What are we doing on college campuses? What are we doing in local communities and at kitchen tables and over Zoom? Well, without going into all of the details, we have a range of activities, workshops, and organizing strategies that allow people to come together to learn the skills by which we communicate empathetically, to learn the internal discipline necessary to be able to resist the stereotyping narratives that are downloaded into us from the media establishment, such that when you see somebody who happens to be wearing a MAGA cap or a Black Lives Matter shirt, that instead of seeing somebody who you automatically take to be a racist or a fascist, or somebody you take to be as a radical anti-American communist or something like that, you see a human being, and you have some sense of the complexity that may go into their life experience and the factors and circumstances of their social reality that may have led them to the politics that they hold, whether you agree with them or not. And in so doing, you position yourself to be able to communicate with those folks, whether they're strangers or members of your own family, right? That's what we do. And I encourage folks to learn more about what we do in greater detail at braverangels.org. And of course, you'll see the website link in the description. But I want to say a little bit more about this movement. And by the way, it's not just Braver Angels. There are organizations and groups and folks across America who are taking the time and dedicating their lives to making it possible for us to relate to each other and to empathize with each other once again, to heal the divisions, to heal the wounds that have opened in American life. But I should tell you a little bit about why this matters to me. Some of you will know my story, and some of you will not. And so I'll say that, well, over the course of this show, over the course of this podcast, one thing I want to talk a lot about is identity. Identity. It's a word, like so many other words, that has become a little bit loaded in the current political discourse. But I think it's necessary to grasp it a little bit. Let me lean into my labels very quickly. I am half African American, half Anglo American. My mother is from inner city Los Angeles. My father is from a small town in Tennessee. She grew up in an economically modest way in South Central LA. My father grew up with great wealth, great affluence. My dad's a baby boomer. He was born on the 50-yard line of the 20th century, 1950. My mother was born 13 years later. I grew up in a household and in a family that suffered under the weight of cultural divisions within it that, made it difficult, I think, for my parents to understand each other, sometimes difficult for members of perhaps either side of the family to totally understand the other side. But I grew up loving my mother, loving my father. My mother, by the way, voted for Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton before him. My father voted for Donald Trump in each election. And I am conscious of the fact that I need say no more, at least to some folks who are out there in America, and many of you will understand perfectly what I mean, that I need say no more about their politics than that to give some folks some justification for making assumptions about the character of my parents, if you will, or to at least give people cause for doubt or concern. How could a person believe certain things politically and still be a good person, right? These are the sorts of things that go through people's minds. I'm also sensitive to the fact that some folks watching will be saying, okay, I get what he's saying about polarization, but isn't there a risk of a both sidesism here? And that's a fair point. One side is not necessarily going to be equally right or equally wrong to the other. There is a difference in any given circumstances to the legitimacy or the logical sort of integrity of one side's arguments or the other. But there's always an equal human reality in terms of the fact that we are all of us products of our experiences, human experiences. And for myself, I was in a position growing up to be able to see the humanity in my mother and my father and my relatives on each side of the aisle and in folks who come from across this vast tapestry of American life. And I have come away with the conviction that says that ultimately, if it is the case that the things that we believe politically are products of the things that we have experienced, then it is important for us to understand the stories that come behind the political points of view that other people bring with them. Because those are the things that add up to our identities, in essence. Now, all of us are not necessarily quick to claim our identities in the form of labels, and some of us are. But I myself am a biracial, again, African-American, Anglo-American, former liberal activist, turned Republican nominee for Congress, turned, what am I now? Social justice conservative or something along those lines. I am a Christian who grew up largely agnostic, person who still doesn't really strongly associate with one denomination or another. I mean, you can say I'm vaguely Protestant, I suppose. Somebody who spent a vital part of his life practicing in New Age communities. I'm a person who has the joy and the privilege and the honor of working with and being in dialogue with many of America's leading public intellectuals, leading scholars on subjects from political science to philosophy to history to theology. But I myself, well, I'd like to I'd like to say that I'm a college dropout, but the truth is that I hardly dropped in. So even that label gives me a little bit too much credit. I am a person with many flaws and many contradictions. I'm a person who has felt some of the pain of the African American experience. I'm a person who has felt some of the pain of the experience of Americans who are told that they are complicit with historical evils that they feel within themselves are not rightfully applied to them because they are not racist, because they are not hateful people. I have felt the doubt of those who walk through life seeking to hold on to the edifice of faith, seeking to believe in a God, in a time in American life and in a time in modern civilization wherein to lean forward with faith is to announce yourself potentially as being superstitious, as being irrational, as being someone whose voice does not properly belong in intellectual conversations. And I have experienced life, as I think all of you have, as a person who, on the one hand, perhaps wants to love his country, and on the other hand, is so painfully aware of some of the flaws and imperfections of his nation that at various points in my life, I have wondered and have been challenged by those who have argued to me that the United States of America, the illusion, the mythology of the land of freedom, is not reflective of the true character of the United States. That our country is one that is born in corruption and moral hypocrisy and remains so. I have wrestled with these claims and these questions. I'm a family man. I have a wife and 3 children, and our family lives and is growing in the crosshairs of our cultural and socioeconomic divisions, like so many of yours. And I do not have all of the answers to those things, but I put myself forward with some of my different hats, some of the different details about who I am, in order to illustrate myself as somebody who may not be as simple as he appears to be on the basis of who I may have voted for, or what you might hear me say in a particular soundbite, or what you might infer about me from my age or the color of my skin. But even if the combination of my labels is a little bit unusual for some folks, the truth is that you are every bit as complex as I am. Your experience is every bit as deep and profound as mine own is in American life. And again, it therefore makes it incumbent for us to understand each other in the context of our different stories, in the context of our varying identities. What does it mean to walk through life as an African American who grew up in the projects and who was raised in a church tradition but was introduced to militant radicalism, who was raised with stories of Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, and who had an uncle who found himself imprisoned for life, or for many years on the basis of a petty drug crime, or a cousin who was shot by gangbangers in the streets. What does it mean to be a working class white person who was raised in an evangelical household, but then saw his cousins die of an opioid overdose, and who looks on at television and who listens to elite cultural figures talk about white people as being privileged, and talk about whiteness as being something that is akin to sort of built-in complicity with the oppression of folks who may genuinely be oppressed in American life, but who do not have a monopoly on life's pains, something that you can testify to personally yourself. What does it mean to be an immigrant? Somebody who came to this country, or whose parents brought them to this country in search of freedom, in search of opportunity, in search of a better life, only to find yourself stuck in the crosshairs of our culture wars and of our politics, only to find yourself distrusted by people who perhaps seem to not want you in this country, or maybe don't want you in this country, only to find yourself sweating to make a life for yourself, to hold on perhaps to your culture, to hold on perhaps to your traditions, as other folks want you to assimilate to a culture that may seem to threaten aspects of who you are. And yet, perhaps you love this country. Perhaps you are deeply dedicated to this country. Perhaps you've served this nation in uniform. Perhaps you've worked in a union or in a corporation and are proud of what you've built and wish to celebrate the fact that you are a part of this country. Or maybe there's a part of you that goes in either or both directions. The point is not to get lost in the details of our differences. The point is to say that we need to make space for ourselves, for each other, to be honest about who we are and how it is we are showing up in the dialogue, so that as we organize politically, as we have our electoral battles, we can nevertheless generate a vision of what America could be in a way that celebrates and honors the dignity of all her people, and in a way that reckons honestly with the social and cultural challenges that face us as a country. I take this very seriously. I don't pretend to be the most sophisticated analyst of American politics. There's so many conversations going on in so many different places. I'm not the person to keep up with all of them. Nobody can. I am trying to start something of a new conversation, and the truth is that conversation has already begun. In fact, it started long before I became anything like visible within it. This conversation over how it is we apply the golden rule to democracy. How is it that we can love our neighbors as we love ourselves, given the fact that we must nevertheless oppose our neighbors, we must nevertheless oppose our friends in order to advocate for the things that we truly believe in terms of the proper way in which we ought to be governing society. It matters to people who you elect, because it matters how it is we choose to deliver or not deliver health care to the American people. That is a matter of life and death. It is it is something that matters to people. Who we sit on the Supreme Court, because who we sit on the Supreme Court can determine whether the American people are or are not free, whether or not our civil liberties are or are not under threat on the basis of the whims of the party in power and judges who may or may not feel themselves positively obligated to honoring the United States Constitution. For instance, it matters who we elect and how we govern, because it matters whether or not women have a right to choose, or whether or not unborn babies have a right to live. These are deep differences between people. But I do believe that love and goodwill has the power not to smooth over all differences and to force us into some generic moderation, but to allow us to live with each other in good faith, whether we win or lose a political battle in the moment. Because ultimately, we must continue the dialectic of American democracy so that we may learn from one another, trust one another, and find the ways in which we can develop consensus and convergence over time so that the system itself endures, so that the republic itself endures as a national community and a body of institutions and traditions and histories that have their own honor, that have their own substance, that have their own reality that we must be sensitive to. It's so easy to think of the entire point of American politics as being, who wins a given race, who wins a given election. But the true victory is our ability to live alongside one another. And so, in this show, it won't all be philosophy, trust me. I will be speaking to influential figures from the left, the right, the center, trying to engage people in every part of our society on this question of, well, first of all, exploring with my guests what it is they believe, why it is they believe, and what experiences have been a part of shaping their perspectives, and then challenging folks to see the best in the people on the other side, or to see at least what is legitimate in the humanity of their experiences, and therefore what is understandable in the substance of their claims. I hope in that way to model the substance of the philosophy of nonviolence. I hope in that way to do some justice to what I believe, at least, was the greater vision of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who sought a world in which, yes, we judged each other not by the color of our skin, but the content of our character. That is important, but who even more deeply sought a world and a nation in which we are willing to apply the power of love and goodwill as a spiritual force that can affect positive social change, making it possible for even those of us who are enemies to learn from one another and emerge as friends in the beloved community. That was Dr. King's dream. The dream for which he died, and the dream for which some of us are willing to live, at the very least. I do not speak to the camera right now just to entertain you, although I hope that I can be reasonably entertaining, right? Some folks are better at the jokes and better at the humor. I watch Ben Shapiro's show. That guy's got, he's got a great sort of like, acerbic sort of delivery. I mean, he can be, I think a little unfair sometimes, but I like watching him. Dave Rubin has become a bit of a friend of mine, and he's somebody who I'll be talking to shortly. And I love the conversational way in which he does his thing. I've enjoyed the Young Turks. Speaking of Rubin, I've enjoyed the Young Turks for a while. I think that Cenk Uyghur's got a funny sort of, of course, like he's got this flair of personality that I really dig, and so forth. Who knows what kind of personality I am? I am what you see. Let's just put it like that. And some of you folks will probably watch me and think to yourselves, man, this guy's deep. And other you folks are going to be watching me and saying, like, this guy rambles and doesn't say a damn thing. Well, I get it all in the YouTube comments. I get it all in the emails, and I expect to get more of it. That's fine, But more than anything, I hope to communicate to folks watching that, well, As you watch this show and as you come to be familiar with the work and community of braver angels, of the people who you see on this program and on the various programs we offer, and not just, again, the folks in our organization, but the folks across this larger movement in American society, to build a house united, to depolarize not just our politics, but to heal the wounds that exist between us, that stand between us and the promised land, to borrow King's language once more. I hope that folks understand that there is a different way forward, a better way forward than what is being shown to us by the political polls, if you will. And it is not to condemn your favorite pundit on Fox News or MSNBC or what have you, to say that society is always changing and must change, even as society must also reach back for the things that are best in us that we sometimes are at risk of forgetting. And that this requires us to be imaginative and to illustrate for ourselves new ways in which we can come together in order to honor old truths. Once again, I return to the golden rule, this idea that we love one another as we love ourselves, and that has to be the foundation upon which all of our complex and intellectual and ideological sorts of policies and solutions can deploy themselves. But this foundation needs to hold firm, this commitment to love in society. There's a way for us to do that. There's a way for us to go forward together. And I want to bring you on that journey with me here on the John Wood Jr. Show.